Well, welcome onto the podcast, Bryce and Matt. If anybody's unfamiliar, today we have on Matt Cronin and Bryce Krawczyk. So, on this podcast, we like to start with what we call the cold open, which is kind of a little bit of, I guess, like a surprise question, a little bit of a like just ease into the podcast with something fun. You're sideways, Matt. So, because you guys are both metal music fan enthusiasts, I have two quick cold open questions for you guys. The first one being, I won't ask you for like a favorite record because, it's hard to pick favorites, but I would like you guys to each maybe just give like a metal record recommendation for the audience.
Man, we could go so many different routes on this one, I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm keeping it like totally inaccessible and extreme and crazy, I think my favorite like death metal record of all time is probably Suffocation Pierce from Within. And if you've never heard it and you've never heard anything like it and you're listening, you're probably not going to like it. We should still check it out. And maybe you will.
Okay. Yeah. I think I'll go the opposite direction for something that's a little more easy to get into. One of my favorite albums for a long time growing up, and something that influenced me a lot when I was like playing in bands and stuff, was the album Nocturnal by the Black Dahlia Murder. So I would say check that one out. Some real bangers on it. And yeah, back in the day when music videos were still a thing, I'll date myself a little bit here, but there's some real good music videos off of that album too. From the one song "What a Horrible Night to Have a Curse." Check that out.
Yeah, that's a beast of a record right there, dude. That's definitely a more accessible one. And I'm already feel like I'm already getting off topic and tangential, but are you like a metalcore guy? Like Killswitch Engage was maybe that should be my accessible answer.
I do
like
love Killswitch.
third grade, dude. Arms of Sorrow or whatever year it was that came on like Fuse TV here in the States. And I think it changed my life for better or for worse for forever after that.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
Then to build off of that a little bit and kind of loop it back into powerlifting, I think back in the day when I got into powerlifting, not that I'm like a huge metalhead or anything like that, but when I got into powerlifting, I feel like metal music was much more of the norm and much more like popular among powerlifters.
Yeah.
And I would say probably the same for both of you guys. So my question is has powerlifting gotten too far away from the metal era?
Selfishly, I'm going to say yes. And the reason I'm going to say that is kind of joking, but like every time I go to a meet and I hear the like playlist that the meet director is playing, I lose my mind like every single time. Everyone obviously has their opinion. And I think that like hard music and music that you can listen to that, incites being aggressive in training and stuff, it doesn't have to be metal for that to happen. But I feel like at least with the way that I like to train and maybe the nostalgia of like the old guard, I do feel like some of that, at least some of that energy, or, similar vibe and similar energy is often missing. I see people like posting their lifting and they're listening to like Lana Del Rey or something, and I'm like, you could have squatted 5 kilos more if you were listening to anything other than this,
I my like PL Mega Mix playlist of just like everything I've ever enjoyed lifting to. I think it's like 6 or 10 hours long or something. It has a lot of Dua Lipa on it. I'm a big fan of like some pop bangers in the gym. I think a lot of the times if I'm going to do a heavy set, that might be like a song that plays while I'm loading the bar or something. I might change that when I go to get under the bar. But yeah, I think I agree. There's definitely a lot of bad music played at powerlifting meets. I think Disturbed is a bad band. I think the music is terrible, and I will just have that objective opinion about it. But yeah, I mean, I think people should just listen to whatever gets them hyped up. Like everybody's got headphones anyways, right? So whatever your jam is. I know some people listen to like classical music or like anime what AMVs, animated like motivational stuff. Like if that's your jam, oh man, just do your thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would more or less agree with that. Like, I'm kind of being, what's sort of the like, is there a thing with cursing on this podcast? Can I?
Max?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, just like being a dick. Like, I wish people listen to better music sometimes, but the reality is you listen to whatever hypes you up, and Dua Lipa is not what I expected you to say, and I'm not familiar with Dua Lipa like at all, but I'm sure she's got like some hard songs, some like high energy, whatever type of things, and yeah, I think that's the important thing. Is just listening to what you like, but I feel like day to day, or like as time goes on, I feel like I relate less and less culturally.
I get that. Max, I can't hear you, brother.
That's fair. I think your screen went black for some reason, Matt. I'll kind of let Arshia cue us into the next question here, but just wanted to let you know that's going on in case you don't know.
Yeah, I just had a question come up in my head while we were talking about that. How big of a role do you guys think music has in lifting weights and like the mentality? Could you get into it just as much without like lifting in silence in the warming up and top sets? Yeah.
I think for me, like music is such a important fundamental thing in terms of like how I'm feeling in any given moment. I think a lot of the times, like even if I go to the grocery store, if there's like some good old classic rock or something that I can kind of vibe on, like I'm having a better day at the grocery store.
Yeah.
If I go to the gym and there's better music playing, I'm enjoying myself more. I think for me, silence is like, it's fine. And I think also when you get to the point where like you're about to step out on the platform at a competition or something, kind of doesn't matter, right? Like you got to take your headphones out anyways. And if there isn't enough like stimulus and adrenaline amping you up at that point, like that's a bigger problem. But I think when it comes to training, like 100% music plays a very big role in how much I'm enjoying my training, how invested I am, how intentional I can be, how focused I am, how much intensity I can put into what I'm doing. Yeah.
Awesome.
Matt, what about you? Did we lose him?
We might have lost him.
Do you want to cue Bryce up for the next question here?
Yeah, let's get into it. I think Matt should probably be back pretty quick here. So yeah, my question is, what kind of trends have you seen come and go in powerlifting? What's kind of been some of the ones that have stuck out to you?
There's been a lot. I've been around a minute or two.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think just general fitness trends, things like DUP and different sort of ways of organizing your training and periodizing and the back and forth on that. I think has been something that seems really cyclical. That seems to be something that a lot of people will grab onto and then kind of jump onto the new thing. I think the most recent of those is this kind of like really high frequency polarized approach that I've heard a lot about and actually have incorporated a decent amount of into my own programming practice and coaching practice. That was popularized by Pavel. I'm not going to say his last name right, but Dzerzhinsky, Agata's coach. Cool dude, plays Magic. Yeah. Big fan.
Also, Max's coach as of
nice.
weeks ago.
Okay, there you go. Sick. Yeah, I like him. I think he's very smart. I think he's a very good coach. And I think a lot of what he's doing is it's kind of an interesting and fresh take on just the specificity and stuff. The other thing is like, it's not necessarily a brand new idea, right? Like you look back at who was it? It was Dietmar Wolf and like CYC, Karl Ingvar Christensen back in the day. And I think they were, they were proponents of this like Norwegian frequency project, where they did a study on, taking a normalized amount of volume across two groups. And admittedly, they were, maybe small sample sizes, but taking that work and spreading it out into more frequencies, I think just by virtue of adding more warm-up sets and more reps in total and more frequent exposure to the movements, like it seemed like it had a pretty solid impact and pretty pronounced benefit to it. So, frequency is one of those things that I think has really been up and downing. But yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff like even just periodization models, bottom up versus top down. I think for a long time, the sort of like very phasic structure of like, okay, you got to do your hypertrophy block and then your strength block and then your peaking block, and having that sort of like big annual plan and having everything planned out and undulating your rep ranges every week and that kind of stuff was very much how things were done. And I think it's much more common nowadays to see something more like a bottom-up approach where you're, kind of building a microcycle, doing one really, really good week and trying to just repeat that till it stops working. That's, something that I think was very much popularized by Mike T with the emerging strategies way of looking at things. And again, something I have incorporated pretty heavily for the last number of years in my programming. But yeah, those are probably two of the biggest trends I've noticed coming and going, and I think in large part staying at this point. But yeah, trying to think of what else. VBT, velocity-based training, something that kind of pops up here and there. I just got another velocity unit that I'm looking forward to messing around with, trying to see what Mike has cooked up for that. But yeah.
Matt, any trends you've seen come and go?
He's kind of phasing in and out. He's coming and going himself.
I guess to kind of build off of that, has there been any trends that you've seen not return? Like a lot of the trends you've kind of mentioned, like have been trends that have kind of stuck around, but has there been any where you're like, this was like super popular, but then it kind of died and like never came back or hasn't kind of come back around yet?
Like a real flash in the pan kind of thing, hey? I feel like there's some like exercises and stuff. Like I remember there being Candido he had some deadlift. I think it was like it's like a wide stance conventional thing or like a sumo snatch grip or something like that. And I think that was all the hotness for a couple minutes. Trying to think of what else. I don't know if the ones that have gone have been ones that I've like paid as much attention to. But definitely like maybe like more conjugate stuff. People trying to like make like West Side philosophies work. And conjugate is maybe mischaracterizing it because everything's kind of conjugate, but the whole West Side approach of like having like, your intensity day and your volume day and, circa max band cycles and that kind of stuff. And maybe that's kind of phased out as a result of just Multiply maybe not having the trajectory that Multiply fans would want. But
yeah, that's kind of like that played a big influence on powerlifting back in the day. And I feel like a lot of the methodology was based off of that. I remember even like the slingshot was a big hype back in the day. Everybody was getting a slingshot, even if you weren't in equipment. It's like, yeah, grab a slingshot.
Yeah. I mean, I still like those things. I still use them sometimes. Again, I think maybe more with equipped lifters than raw lifters, but it's like, I don't know. I use a lot of board press and stuff like that, bench against bands. Even for raw lifters, I think there's some utility in overloading stuff, especially for the bench.
That's fair. Well, Matt is trying to get back in and having some struggles here. I will kind of cue you up for the next question here. It is too bad. I wanted to hear kind of some back and forth between you and Matt on some of these different things, but I do think you kind of perfectly segued us into it of when do you use different overload techniques that allow you to get like more load or more tension on the bar, bands, chains, boards, versus when do you use more like load limiting variations like pause squats or tempo deadlifts, etc.?
I think personally, a lot of the, let's say, slots that those exercises would occupy are going to be very similar. Those are to me like a secondary movement. And I don't necessarily differentiate. Maybe with bench, there's room to have some of each, right? Because more often than not, we're seeing more bench exposures throughout an average week of training in a lifter's program than we would for, say, squat or deadlift. But I do think there's a tendency to lean towards more overload work for my equipped lifters. If I have them doing a raw day, maybe they're doing just a normal raw squat, but maybe they're squatting against chains or benching against bands or deadlifting against bands. I think that like specifically accommodating resistance, working against bands and chains. I tend to think that for a lot of raw lifters, there's a lot of utility in those for the deadlift, and it's just purely anecdotal. It's what I've seen work in lifters who I've coached and through my own training. But I think that having that kind of resistance profile where it doesn't necessarily get easier as the weight goes up. Obviously you're gaining some mechanical advantage and leverage advantage, but that band is stretching or those chains are picking up off the floor. So that kind of counteracts the advantages. So, you could argue maybe you're getting a little more work out of the top end, out of those muscles that are contributing more at that part of the range of motion. And I think for some lifters, being able to focus in on those things can be really useful. I have a few lifters who have struggled and some that still do struggle with kind of transition, specifically in, conventional or I guess both deadlifts, but trying to go from like the push to the pull, right? As the bar kind of goes past the knees, some lifters tend to kind of have an issue with timing that correctly or having, enough momentum to carry them through that part of the range of motion. So I think in a lot of cases, having some bands or chains, some sort of overload stimulus is good on maybe the deadlift more than the squat in my experience with raw lifters. But
Okay, welcome back, Matt. We've kind of gone we've kind of gone through two questions here, which Bryce is going to have to leave a little sooner than you, so maybe we'll work our way back to the first question after Bryce takes off. But Bryce just kind of finished answering the question of when you would use overload techniques versus load limiting like variations. So like when would you maybe program like bands, chains, board press, touch and go bench compared to like when would you program like a long pause bench or like a pause squat or like a tempo deadlift kind of thing?
Dude, it just keeps dropping out on me for some reason, but you guys are back now. So I'm gonna keep ripping here, and I'm super. I don't know if it's something on my end, but I'm very, very sorry for the interruptions on my end. But
yeah,
when I was looking at the question with load, overload versus load limiting, I kind of thought about it, and I was like, I haven't really, outside of bench press specific stuff, spent a ton of time with overload type stuff. When it comes to bench, I'll definitely use it, particularly with something like touch and go. But I haven't really played with, say, reverse bands or chains all too much. We've kind of talked about this a little bit on the Powerlifting Now podcast with Steve, and I think a big piece of why I haven't really experimented with it too much is because a lot of lifters, at least here in the States, like don't really have the access to that type of equipment anymore. It's gone from everyone squatting in rogue power racks with band pegs that are adjustable to everyone's squatting in combo racks now, and chains are just a total thing of the past, and boards are only there to be like tripods for phones and stuff. But it's hard for me to think that there's not some type of value in stuff like chain work or reverse band work or, kind of traditional band work. And I think that would be something I would like to maybe have a little bit more experience playing around with, probably with bench for the top end overload stuff, the band work, the chain work. And I think the only one that I really feel like would have a lot of merit for using like a reverse band for would probably be a deadlift. Kind of, I caught the end of Bryce's answer there talking about squat probably being a little funky with that stuff. I feel like that could really throw off like bar path and like center of mass management and whatnot. But I think that there probably could be a ton of value that I haven't really had the opportunity to explore. But with the stuff that I have that had the chance to explore, like touch and go and whatnot, I've really actually kind of grown a large liking to that variation, particularly with certain styles of bench pressers, particularly guys that, or girls, struggle with rep work and like have that really intense RPE kind of spike that we see some people have, like longer arm guys. They'll hit a set of 5 and rep 4 looks like it's an RPE 6, and then rep 5 is like 9 or 9.5. And I think it has to do particularly with just general time under tension and the amount of fatigue that builds up in the pecs while pausing in the bottom. And then you're not able to create that same velocity off the chest that kind of goes through that top end. So I've kind of used touch and go a lot in those regards. And then when it comes to load limiting stuff, I think that's more kind of where I've got a ton of experience with variations for whether it's just fatigue management or it's, trying to load limit around a injury or, chronic issue that we're dealing with or whatever the case is. Like those have been, I think, a bread and butter in my training for quite a while. But yeah, I would really love to be able to experiment a little bit more with stuff like bands and chains, reverse bands, whatever the case is. And forgive me, Bryce, if this is like something you already answered. I know the RTS system does use some of those more overload, variations, or at least I should say, I know Mike T has prescribed those over time. Mm-hmm. Is like the reverse band stuff anything that you guys have ever played with?
Reverse band, like a lot less so. I think I've run that like maybe once in lieu of equipped deadlift, like to try to get something similar. Maybe I didn't have access to my suit or something for some reason, and I was like, this is probably a pretty similar-ish kind of replacement. I think generally if I'm using bands on the deadlift, I'm just having the lifter like stand on it or put down some dumbbells or something like that. And yeah, I don't know that I've ever prescribed reverse band squats. So yeah, not a whole lot of reverse band stuff. I think if I'm using bands, I'm probably having it set up at the bottom,
traditional way,
adding a little bit more resistance. Yeah.
Is there like a particular like archetype of lifter that you feel does well with, say, the banded deadlift? Do you have a certain lifter that you see, or like I said, archetype where you look at this lifter and think, yeah, I'm probably going to give this to them? Or is it more of an experimental type of thing where it's like, we're doing this development block or whatever, and we're not close to a competition. We've never tried this before, so let's try it and see what happens?
I think probably a little bit of both. I think a lot of the times, a lot of things are pretty experimental, but anytime I'm seeing a lifter who struggles with the kind of transition point through the deadlift, like the bar passing the knees, being able to like keep quads going without scooting the knees underneath and trying to get too upright and, stuff like that. Or maybe we're losing position off the floor such that we're getting hammered at lockout and it's super sticky. I usually take kind of a two-pronged approach in both utilizing something like a pause deadlift to reinforce good positioning off the floor, but also if we're going to lose that positioning, if we're going to be struggling at lockout, like let's hammer lockout. Let's put some bands on there. Let's hit it even harder so that you're even stronger when we get to that, whether it's good or bad position, but that we have a little more kind of extra gas on that top end. So those are kind of the things, and it's maybe more in the movement patterns when I'm seeing them deadlift that I'm assessing versus like a limb length or something like that. But yeah, those would be the lifters I'm probably looking to use bands on more often than not.
Yeah, there's just some guys that like, no matter what you do, they're too stocky to like ever make the deadlift perfect. So I just imagine that's probably a case where it's like, all right, this is what it is. We just got to make it better. Make this imperfect thing stronger and just drive the ceiling up. So yeah, that might be something that I play around with because, like you said, I guess just standing on the band is probably the most accessible variation as opposed to doing some setup with bench press or whatever. I remember growing up and like there was a couple dudes in my gym who used to train on just like standalone floors of bench, and just watching the stuff that they would do to set up bands or trains was like it was the most MacGyver crazy shit I've ever seen. And I think that's pretty similar to what we're seeing nowadays.
Yeah, and I think like you said, like chains are tough. Like unless you have the full setup and you have like a catch chain and you have the right length of chain and you know how to set them up and you have somewhere to store them. Like if it's not at your gym, you're not going to like just bring, and I guess I did this when I was young, but you're generally not going to bring like 40 kilos of chains in your bag to the gym. Like nobody's going to do that shit, but it's easy as hell to just throw a band in there, so that tends to be a lot more accessible.
For sure.
Another thing I was going to say with the like overload, I think I tend to think that there's a pretty strong case for using board presses in raw lifters training. And I think there are a couple different instances where they can be really useful. One of those, and maybe the most relevant and one worth talking about, is lifters who need like a decent amount of stimulus, decent amount of frequency, decent amount of volume on the bench, but who also are presumably pretty strong and tend to get beat up from the amount of work it takes and incur little, shoulder, pec tweaks and stuff like that. I think by cutting out the bottom end of the range of motion on, one of those exposures a week, I've had a lot of success with a few lifters in particular, still being able to like really push hard, get a lot of good bench training in, and going from, 4 variations where we're focusing on the bottom end. There's a pause down there. We're spending a whole bunch of time in that like fully stretched position, to using something like a 1 or a 2 board press. We're able to still get a whole heck of a lot of training stimulus on them without running into as many of those little overuse injuries and tweaks and stuff like that.
Yeah, I've used that. I've got one guy I can think of where I've done a similar thing, and for him it was more of like a volume accumulation thing. Just like after he hits his top set on that day, it's like a bunch of sets of like 6 to 8, depending on where we're at, with a one board, just because he's just prone to, like, if I kind of leave everything as it is otherwise or as it was, like he was just coming to every training session and be like, yeah, my pecs are fried, so they're just like smoked today. So doing that just added such a nice quality of life kind of boost. But I don't know if I've ever used it in like I guess the traditional, I guess maybe more like equipped way of thinking, like overload style, where it's like, oh, you bench 315, we're taking 365 to a 4 board or something like that. Like, I don't think I've ever used it in that case.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd be reaching for a 4 board in most raw lifters training, but I think like a 1 to 2 board a lot of the times could be like a pretty useful overload tool. I don't know that it's necessarily preferable to or better than any other methods, but I definitely keep that in the toolbox as one of my semi-frequent go-tos, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like for me, the use cases, like they usually end up being fairly similar to touch and go. I guess it's just more of the level of extremity that the person's getting, that kind of tenderness in the pecs from being in the bottom. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Bryce, you touched on the accessibility of boards and things like that. What do you think if someone has better access to, like, let's say a squat cage and they could do pin press or a spotter press, do you think we're getting the same amounts as a board, or what do you think the differences are? And Matt, feel free to definitely chime in on this as well.
I think the way somebody's using a board, or the way I would encourage them to use a board as a raw lifter, is probably pretty damn close to a spoto press. I'm not gonna lie to you.
Yeah.
I think, and you see this in equipped lifting, but like people can get really good at board press to the point where they're like utilizing the right amount of sink and right amount of like chest heave and little like push to get the bar going. They get really good at board press, and then it's like, especially in a shirt, And then it's like, okay, touch your chest. And it's like, it's a totally different lift.
Yeah.
And that's also, in training for equipped lifters, that's how I will use them, is like, we're not expecting our board press to be super relevant to our comp press, because, we always want to have some exposures where we're at least ghosting, right? Like going as low as we can to where the shirt binds up, seeing if we can get some extra range of motion, whatever. But definitely for equipped lifters, and maybe I'm getting a little off topic here, but I do find that, that like last one board makes it just a different lift to touch. But I think for a lot of instances, we're probably getting something very similar out of a Spoto press to a one board press. The other, use case, I think, would be something like what Matt was saying, like high reps. A lot of times I'll do a close grip 2-board press for, 8 to 10s or something like that. If I really want to hammer triceps in that lifter, I think that's a really great tricep variation that tends to be, isolated enough that we can use it as a less specific variation, because it doesn't necessarily give us the same amount of fatigue in, pecs, delts, whatever. But it's also maybe a little bit more specific, maybe a little bit more transferable to our press, because it is a press itself.
Yeah.
I would mostly agree with all that. Like I said, I don't have a ton of experience prescribing board press, really just like a couple use cases here and there. But I'm really usually trying to get people to like mimic their comp bench technique as much as possible. It's like, all right, if you touch your chest, super soft, touch the board, super soft. I do really like pin pressing, but I think that does change it a little bit. I think pin pressing just generally makes it even more difficult to get the bar moving, just because you're getting rid of like all of that. I don't know what the proper term is, but like all that ability to kind of like absorb that force and then throw it off of you, versus like when you're on that pin, like all of that inertia is just gone. And now you have to get the bar to move from just that total dead position. So I think that can change the movement a little bit. And I think it could likely make it more difficult. Obviously, if we're talking elevating the pins up, like to a certain extent, you're not really dealing with getting the pecs involved very much at all. But I think I would probably agree with most of Bryce's sentiments there. Like, don't make the board press into a circus lift, and it probably will probably do the job that you need it to do.
Arshia, do you want to queue him up for the next question here?
Yeah. Bryce, you kind of touched on this earlier, and gonna swing back here on it. And my next question is, how different should training be when we're periodizing? We talked about how we used to go through different periodization models, do your volume, realization, peaking, things like that. And how has that changed? And then how are you programming? How should training be when periodizing?
So I kind of mentioned earlier, using a pretty bottom-up approach, starting with
Yeah.
a microcycle, repeating until it, the adaptations stop happening or we see a decline in performance. From that first sort of exploratory microcycle, we tend to get a bit of an idea of how long block length should be. From that first block, we start to pull out what's working, what isn't. And I think when it comes to then starting to plan at the higher and higher levels, the biggest thing I'm trying to do is identify trends and try to take maybe a bit of a departure from what's working in, post meet windows and things like that. I definitely think, there's a lot of value in trying to push for maybe some different adaptations in those periods of time, a little bit of a hypertrophy focused block, trying to push work capacity. I think in a lot of cases that comes down to trying to then, further individualize the sort of phases that a lifter needs, right? Over a long period of time, you start to be able to say like, okay, I know this lifter needs, 2 volume or hypertrophy or whatever, non-specific, less specific phases. And then we need to have one phase that kind of melds that into some more, skills acquisition stuff. And then 1 peaking block or 2 peaking blocks. And then the next time we run that, maybe we try to change one thing in that sort of like 5 block structure. And maybe we're doing, just one peaking phase as opposed to two. But over time, the idea is to try to run these like little, I guess, mini experiments to see how that phasic structure impacts our output and impacts our overall performance. And then trying to track metrics across, from the volume block to the volume block, as opposed to looking at, volume block E1RMs and, E1RMs from a peaking block or something, because that's depressing. But yeah, just trying to be like, okay, can we add a couple sets to this volume block? Can we, what do we feel like are lagging muscle groups maybe? Where can we add a little bit more accessory stimulus? And yeah, try to build that stuff up kind of within that bottom up structure, but then eventually having a bit more of a long-term plan, provided that fits with your competition schedule.
Yeah, I think this is something I've kind of been thinking a lot more about over the last year or two. Is we got so far away from traditional block periodization over the last however many years, because I think we saw all the faults that came along with it, and people like Mike T specifically kind of opening our eyes to the idea of like, some of these blocks may just not be useful to a lifter, and you may just be wasting training time and whatnot. And I think we got very far away from that, or at least I can speak for myself. Like, everything was just kind of bottom up all the time. Everything was like, we're going to do what works right now, and this is what we're going to do. And once we find that approach, we're going to continue it, and we're going to repeat it, and so on and so forth. And I think specifically with lifters that I work with for a really long time, what I kept running into was, we make great progress for however long in the initial onset of us working together, and then we kind of end up hitting a wall at some point. And it's like, how do we kind of get past this wall? And it's like, do we just keep doing what we've been doing? Do we need to flip everything on its head? Do we need to now identify what those bottlenecks are and spend a lot of our time digging into those? And I think that was a flaw in the system that I was approaching programming with. And I've, in, like I said, more recent times, been trying to incorporate and kind of meld the things that I think block periodization does really well, and the value that it brings, into this kind of more bottom up or golden micro, whatever sort of approach. And I think that has led to what a hypertrophy block or what a volume block looks like. I think it has lent itself to that looking a lot different for me in the current era versus when I started doing it, like, probably almost 10 years ago at this point. And it doesn't necessarily mean, okay, we're doing a volume block, so we're going to do 8s and 10s or whatever. It's now we're going to try to drive that work capacity up, as Bryce was saying, or we're going to add a couple more sets and see if we can kind of overreach you a little bit. And then as we get into the next phase, we can pull that back, and that will help to, create some more capacity to train harder or to super compensate, or whatever the case is. And I've started to kind of develop that sort of longer term, approach a little bit more that I used to have with block periodization, but hopefully with less and less of the drawbacks that traditional block periodization, brought about. And I think another underrated aspect of it as well is it allows you to kind of desensitize to those things that you do find work really well. If you have that really, really strong, tried and true development block that you see works when you repeat it 2 or 3 times and then it fizzles out, okay, how do I structure training so that when we are 20 weeks out, 16 weeks out, whatever, we can spend time doing stuff that's still meaningful, but isn't the greatest hits. And we can kind of set ourselves up to go into, those greatest hits blocks with the hopefully largest potential for success and the largest return on that investment. So that's definitely something I've been, thinking about a lot more and, implementing a lot more in the last, like I said, year or two. And what those further out blocks look like, it can be experimental. It can be maintaining the spirit of what those development blocks look like and just kind of adding on top of that. It could be changing it for the sake of the lifter's mental. I think there's a lot of things that you can bring into consideration when it comes to writing those blocks. And I think it, like getting rid of some of the mundane, I don't think mundaneness is a word, but eliminating some of the mundane aspects of training as a power lifter, which is very repetitive, I think can also just go a really long way by having that variation from block to block. And it's like a lifter preps for 20 weeks and their training looks largely the same. And then they finish the meet and you go, okay, let's do it again. And it's, sometimes it's a little bit daunting for a lot of people. So doing something different, I feel like, if it's good for the mental and then it's good for setting you up for long term, it's just kind of a win-win. So yeah, I don't know if that exactly answered what the question is, but it was more just me going off on a tangent on how I've been approaching it.
And I think that like what you're saying there points towards like the difference between somebody who sees these kind of programming and sort of like periodization philosophy trends and is like, okay, I'm just going to do this, versus somebody who's continually being analytical and saying like, well, how do I take what's working from this system and what's working from this system and start to meld these things in ways that we're covering for some of the weaknesses from one approach with the strengths from another. So yeah, just well put.
Appreciate it, bro. Thank you. I always champion Louis Simmons all the time, even though everyone loves to hate on Louis in modern day. I think he's coming around again and people are appreciating him again. But I know like 10 years ago when I started coaching, like I thought Louis was like, I was like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. This doesn't work for lifting. This doesn't work for raw lifting or whatever. And I think that all of the people that have made a name for themselves and have like really created a legacy for themselves, like that's exactly what they always do. Louis took the Russian stuff and like I think the West Side Barbell was like the place in California or whatever. He took those principles and he made it his own and improved upon it. And Mike T, I know he's read a lot into like Bonner-Chuck and I'm sure a million other, more classical components of training. And it's like, okay, like what has time shown us is lacking within these systems? Because usually it takes a long time of fleshing out a system to really pick up on like what's missing and what works really well. And then from there, you hand it off to the next guy up and he hopefully just improves upon it. And that's like, I think all we can really, really ask of ourselves to do. And that's what I'm really trying to do. Especially being around. I mean, Bryce, you've been around for like pretty good while now. Like I think you were making YouTube videos like when I started coaching, like I don't know, in like 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So I'm sure you've kind of gone through all of the different phases and whatnot. And I'm sure when I wasn't here, when my internet or whatever was crashing out on me, that was what you talked about with the trends portion of the podcast and whatnot.
A little bit, yeah. Seen some things.
You've been around for a long time, Bryce.
Speaking of that, I just had a question. Speaking of like seeing a bunch of things come and go, I think the one thing that we've seen quite a bit and is still being used is RPE. Do you guys think that the way we've been using RPE has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably, again, like Matt was saying there, I think there was probably like a really kind of like aggressive early adoption of it, where it was like percentages are stupid, never give your client a bar load.
Yeah.
RPE is the only thing that matters. Yeah. And now I think we've, hopefully found a little more peace with being able to give some maybe strict regulations or suggestions with bar load. I find myself leaning on percentages not infrequently. Giving somebody a load cap or a suggested jump for the next week. But, I think RPE is at this point pretty foundational and fundamental. Like if you want to do a good job of, and maybe it's not RP, maybe it's RIR, like same thing to me basically. But I think that some degree of like subjective rating of difficulty, even just in terms of being able to track performance or have an idea of how well somebody's progressing is, you're doing yourself a disservice to not be using it to some extent. But I don't think it's maybe as like, like this is the one thing we need as maybe it was.
Cool. Yeah, I would pretty much agree with that too. I think that there was, and I'm throwing stones from a glass house when I say this, because I think RPE became popular when I was pretty early on in my coaching. Like I think I think it made an excuse to be lazy and to not like learn about percentage ranges. And, you know, like I wonder how many people nowadays, even if it's outdated, even if it means nothing, like know what Prilipid's chart is or something like that. It's probably pretty small number. And I felt like RPEs kind of come up or I don't know how popular it became just led to people being lazy about coaching. And it was just like you said, RPE everything. And from a coaching perspective, I think nowadays, I think probably a majority of the work that I prescribe is percentage based to some extent, and percentage based being like percentage of a training max. And then there's a good amount of stuff where it's like a percentage of whatever you hit for the day's top set. And then obviously there's the RPE based stuff in there. And I feel like that has given me a lot more kind of control over the variability that we see, over the course of someone's training blocks. And it can kind of let people guide their progression on their top sets a little bit more and then not have as much consequential stuff happen on the back off sets. Because if everything is minus 10% of your back off set and you make some 20 kilo jump, now, all your back off sets are going up in parallel alongside that. I think from a perspective of the athletes, I do think RPE has definitely become like a little misused for some athletes when not given the right guidance. And I think there's a couple different examples of this. And like one is the people who just focus on just bar speed alone. Like you put the bar on their back and they hit like a quote unquote RPE 8 single. And it's like they know for sure when they're doing it. Like if you ask me to triple this, I'm going to die. But then they watch the video and they go, oh no, that was RPE 8, bro. That moved good. And to me, I think the answer kind of lies a little bit in the middle sometimes, but I think people kind of lean too far into the visual aspect of things at times because at the end of the day, RPE is the rate of perceived exertion. And I think that the rating should probably be what the bar feels like and not what you see when you go back and watch your footage and whatnot. And I think the way that people misuse it, like really egregiously these days, is like I call them like chronic block pacers, like the people who are so obsessed with block pacing and like pacing out for the perfect top set at the end of the block. It's like people have a 4 or 5 week training block and like they just ignore the RPE for the first like 3 weeks because they're scared of like coming into their 4th week, or their 4th week, or their 5th week and being like a little fatigued or a little tired from the week prior. So they just like, oh, RPE 6 means it's easy, so I'm just going to hit something easy. And then that's it. And they kind of move on. And it's like, well, if I actually, ask you to take that for an AMRAP, you're probably getting 10 or whatever it is, And I think that that's a way that people kind of misuse RPE a little bit and, probably need a little bit more guidance, whether it's through the programming itself and saying, this is the range I need you to hit, or this is the minimum number you need to hit or whatever. Or the other way around, just kind of teaching them more like about what RPE actually is. I'm sure you've gone through this, Bryce, where you have someone send you their accessories and it's like, you're not even anywhere close to failure. So I'm going to have you AMRAP the same way that you did this week and watch you puke next week. And then now you know what training hard feels like. And obviously there's kind of a fundamental difference in like a RPE 8 single on a squat and how that's going to fail versus like a leg press, set at 12 and 8. There's a lot of different components that are, going on there between each one. But regardless, I think, people aren't quite always in tune or accurate with the way that they approach it because they're over obsessing about end of block performance or peak performance or whatever the case is. So I do think that's something that, like, as coaches, we could probably, maybe sometimes do a little bit of a better job on.
I think the biggest thing that that RPE provides is like it creates a kind of language. And I think that's maybe the best way to use it is like it allows you to kind of load this like RPE 8 or RPE 7 or whatever with a whole bunch of context through communication with the athlete as to what you expect when you write RPE 8. And it can even be within a block. It can be like, this is your week 1 RPE 8. So it's not the same as week 5 RPE 8.
Yeah.
But, you go through all of that and you do a good job of communicating all of those things to the athlete using this like shared language of RPE. And once you both have the same definitions for the same sort of points, then I think it really unlocks the capability of it. And I think it's not necessarily the biggest deal if your RPE7 doesn't look like another lifter's or another coach's RPE7. The most important thing is, like, does your RPE7 look like what your coach's RPE7, like what your coach's intention was when writing RPE7? And I think all of those like layers of context and the building of that ability to communicate and use RPE as a language with clients is where it becomes a really, really valuable tool. But like you kind of mentioned, there's a lot of times where that context is all missing, and somebody's left to kind of like look at a chart and be like, well, RPE7 means this, so I'm just going to call it RPE7. But yeah, I think all that context is massive.
I've definitely had like the individuals too who like kind of overanalyze it as well, sort of going the other way. And it's like they'll only ever, like, I prescribe RPE7 and like, oh, the RPE percentage table says that should be 91% or whatever. And I'm like, I would have just programmed you 91% if that's like what I wanted that to be. So I agree that context is hugely important. And again, I think maybe, unfortunately, like some coaches or programmers will say, not even coaches, kind of use that RPE as a way to just be lazy and not like, create the guidance, that is often necessary for, getting what the coach's vision is out of the program. Like I always tell people, like, you're only going to get as much out of the program as like you understand about the program. If you don't understand why the things are set up the way that they're set up, then there's going to be probably a big piece of the pie kind of left on the table,
Yeah.
Well, Bryce, I know you got to go here, so thank you so much for coming on the Slack Pull podcast. Would you like to tell people where they can find you?
Thanks for having me. I'm always very happy to nerd out and get out into the weeds on programming philosophy and that kind of stuff. I don't often get a whole lot of chance to do that on some of our YouTube content because it's very, we try to keep it accessible and that kind of stuff. So it feels good to like to get a little deeper into stuff. But thank you for the opportunity. It's been great chatting with you, Matt, and you guys as well. You can find me at Calgary Barbell pretty much anywhere, and calgarybarbell.com if you're interested in coaching or apparel or any of that kind of stuff. And my personal Instagram is Bryce_CBB.
Thank you so much, Bryce. And we'll keep you here for a minute, Matt.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. I will dip. Bye,
Good talking to you, Bryce. Have a good one, bro.
Well, with some of the technical issues, Matt, we didn't get a chance to hear what trends you've seen come and go. So before we let you go, can we hear about some of the trends you've seen come and go in your time as a powerlifter?
Yeah, absolutely. This was I thought about kind of all the questions before we got on here, thinking about like how can I answer this like as succinctly or as in depth as possible. And there's been a ton of these trends that I've seen over the years, but I always think that they kind of stem from the same place. And I guess I'll just kind of start with some of those trends. The first one being like the belt squat trend, however many years ago, that I feel like it was like Sean Noriega and Chance Mitchell kind of like sparked about. There was like the weighted dip trend a couple of years ago that I was definitely like kind of in on. And more lately, I heard Bryce talking about like the polarized stuff before. Again, my phone or computer or whatever it was crashed out on me at the moment. The other like last one I wrote down was the kind of like obsession with low volume, high intensity hypertrophy training. Like everyone's saying like, oh, we only need to do 2 sets that are difficult. And that's how you're going to get the max hypertrophy, and everything else is useless and everything else is pointless and it's just fatigue and so on and so forth, or whatever the case is. And I think at the end of the day, what ends up happening is someone tries something and they go, wow, this was really great for me. I'm going to tell the world about it. And it's the right person saying it at the right time. And then everyone eats it up. And I used to make fun of Sean for being the belt squat, like arbiter, we'll say, and being like, dude, this is not what you're saying it is. It just, it worked for you or whatever the case is. And he would probably agree with me to some extent, I think now. But I think the reality is like we get obsessed with something. We think that something is like the thing. We kind of hit like Control C and then Control V, apply to all. And then we go, oh, wait a second. This is working for some people. It's not working for everyone. There's context that's required. And not everyone is going to respond to the same thing always. And I think we've seen that in every case where health squats work for some people. The weighted dips work great for some people. Low volume hypertrophy training works excellent for some people, but they need a little bit of extra to kind of drive the needle forward a little bit more, and whatever the case is. So I know that your question was more about the trends itself, but I kind of was like, where did these trends come from? And I think it's that I think it's Instagram, and this worked well for me, so it's got to work well for everybody. Like mentality, essentially.
Yeah, 100%. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Matt. Where can people find you?
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. And I apologize for both you guys and for the listeners for whatever was going on. I don't feel like I did anything wrong, but I probably did. So anyway, you guys can find me on like Instagram, Cronin Strength, or at Cronin Strength. The website is croninstrength.com if you're interested in contacting me for coaching or consultations or anything of that sort. You can also find me as part of Powerlifting Now and Strength Now, as a contributor with content and contributor with programming and with whatnot on Strength Now. And I think that's everything. I don't think I've got anything else I got to plug there.
Oh, you should plug your record Instagram.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I just made like a new physical media. I'm as I'm sure you guys figured out early in the podcast, I'm a big like metal music guy, just music in general, and physical media guy specifically. And I recently made a new Instagram, kind of just showcasing physical media and talking about some of my favorite records and whatnot. And that is at audible.wax.
Yes. And you are also in a band too, a metal band. So if there's any metal listeners, where can they find your music?
Yeah, I am in a metal band. I sing and play guitar in a kind of old school death metal band called Rotting in the Chapel, and you can find that on Instagram if I'm not mistaken. And I'll double check it right now. I think it's just at Rotting in the Chapel, if I'm not mistaken.
Should be. I mean, they can definitely find it on Apple Music because I'm following.
Yeah, you can find it's on all streaming sites if you search that up, and it's just at Rotting in the Chapel. So you search that anywhere, and you'll find us, and you'll hear some gross, inaccessible music. So feel free to check it out if that sounds like it's your thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.
No problem. Take care.
Yeah, you too, man.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for listening. If you've made it all the way to the end of the episode, please go follow our lovely guests and follow us on Instagram. And I don't know if we're on any other platforms. Follow us on Instagram at the Slackpole Podcast. You guys can also find me at Max Hall Fitness. Where can people find you, Arshia?
RSHADY __ on Instagram, and northrise.ca if you're interested in getting coaching.
Yeah. And if you guys have enjoyed this episode, please give us high ratings on whatever platform you're listening on, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Or if you're on YouTube, please drop a comment. Please like this video. And until next time, guys, we will see you later.